Well, New York's Governor David Paterson will not seek re-election. Paterson made that decision after a New York Times report yesterday that detailed domestic abuse allegations against one of his top aides and the governor's possible attempts to interfere in the investigation. Paterson's decision not to seek office clears the way for Attorney General Andrew Cuomo to seek and win the Democratic gubernatorial nomination. Joining us now via Skype is the Dean of New York Political Reporters, Fred Dicker. With almost 30 years covering Albany for the New York Post and his own radio talk show, he's been called a political institution in his own right. Fred, welcome to Bloomberg News. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me, and greetings from Albany.
Fred, talk to us about this seismic shift in New York state politics. What does this mean?
Well, it is an enormous development coming in a state that lost the governor a couple of years ago when Eliot Spitzer had to resign. A lot of people had hoped David Paterson would do a good job. He hasn't, and a lot of Democrats were looking for an excuse to get rid of him. And this scandal that he's now caught up in which he may have improperly been involved in trying to convince a woman not to pursue a court order of protection against one of the governor's top aides, really was the final stop. In a few minutes, we expect him to be saying, as you noted, that he's not going to be seeking election on his own. And it does clear the way for Attorney General Andrew Cuomo, who has a criminal investigation going on now, which could touch on Governor Paterson, clears the way for him to be the Democratic nominee.
And Fred, we should point out to our listeners that Governor Paterson and his administration, they are adamant. They are saying that if phone calls were made, they were to check on the alleged victim's condition and to see if she needed assistance and not to interfere in this investigation in any way. Is that correct?
That's what they're saying. The governor has maintained that, but the lawyer for the woman involved in this case gives a different story. And a number of Democratic politicians with no stake in this have said, what is the governor doing talking to a woman who says she was beaten by one of his aides a day before she was to go into court, and after the governor speaks with her, she doesn't show up in court? A lot of people are suggesting it was just improper for the governor to have any contact at all with an individual in this kind of serious distress.
Fred, let's talk about David Paterson, and you mentioned those days after Eliot Spitzer was forced to resign in that prostitution scandal. David Paterson, a very popular member of the New York legislature, he did have a wellspring of support when he took over. What happened?
Well, you're absolutely right. His approval rating was something about like 65% when he first took over in March of 2008. He had a first good 6 or 7 months. Then he ran into big trouble the following January when he had to make a decision about replacing Hillary Clinton as a U.S. senator. And then he turned to a little-known Kirsten Gillibrand. But in the process, he rejected Caroline Kennedy, sort of an institution in the Democratic Party, in a way that led to her being smeared. Caroline Kennedy was so badly mistreated by Paterson and his aides that people were really shocked by it, and it was from that point forward that his polling numbers started plummeting.
Fred, we should mention that this has national implications as well, because there had been talk that President Obama and some members of his administration had very pointedly suggested to Governor Paterson that he not seek re-election.
That's absolutely true. It's a fact that the president's political operatives sent the message to the governor back in September. He didn't want to hear it. He rejected it and tried to make an issue out of it as if that would make him stronger, when in fact, of course, President Obama carries a great deal of weight here in New York with New York Democrats, and a lot of people couldn't understand why the governor wasn't taking the hint. And the reason the hint was given is because even back then in August and September of last year, the White House and Democrats here in New York realized that David Paterson was so unpopular that having him at the top of the ticket this year could bring a number of Democrats down.
Fred, Andrew Cuomo, obviously waiting in the wings, the son of the former governor. Andrew Cuomo, now the New York State Attorney General. As you mentioned, Governor Paterson is expected to make this announcement shortly. What does this mean for Cuomo's political capital?
Well, it's an amazing story because Cuomo has been criticized for several weeks for not stepping forward and declaring his candidacy. People were accusing him of some degree of political cowardice, and here he is standing on the sidelines as the man he would have had to challenge just disintegrates politically in front of our eyes. It's almost like a sense of destiny. He is, as you note, the son of the former governor. He tried to run for governor in 2002 and fell on his face, but he came back in 2006 and became Attorney General, and now he's the most popular political figure here in New York. It looks like he should have a very smooth run becoming this state's next governor.
Fred, we only have about 30 seconds left. As we mentioned, you're an institution in Albany. You've been covering state politics for a long time. Have you ever seen anything like this?
The last couple of years here in Albany have been like 50 years worth of state history compacted into those 2 years. It's amazing, it's grueling, and it's a sad commentary on what's happened to New York. Hopefully things will be better in January.
Fred Dicker, New York Post reporter, columnist, radio talk show host, joining us from Albany via Skype. Fred, thank you so much for your perspective. We appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.